Today's video is all about the reproductive hormones, and after a brief look at what puberty is, we'll focus on the menstrual cycle. Puberty is basically the period during which adolescents start to develop secondary sexual characteristics, by which we mean things like facial hair in men and breasts in women. This process is triggered by reproductive hormones, which are mainly testosterone in men, which is produced in the testes and also stimulates sperm production, and estrogen in women, which is produced by the ovaries. Now, when it comes to the menstrual cycle, there's quite a lot going on, because there are 4 hormones that interact to bring about the 4 stages of the cycle. So what we're going to do here is briefly discuss each of those stages, then look at what each of the 4 hormones does, and then finally see how those hormones interact, which is highlighted here. Before we start though, I just wanted to make it clear where all of this stuff is happening. This here is a picture of the female reproductive system. We've got the uterus here in the middle, the uterus lining around it, and the ovaries out here on the sides, which are connected to the uterus by these fallopian tubes. If you remember, eggs are kept inside the ovaries, and after ovulation, they're transported along one of the fallopian tubes over to the uterus. If the egg was fertilized during its journey, then it would implant into the uterus lining. Otherwise, it would break down and pass out. So when we talk about the uterus lining building up or breaking down during the menstrual cycle, we're talking about this tissue here in the uterus lining. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can move on to the menstrual cycle. The average length of a menstrual cycle is around 28 days, but it varies a lot between different people, and that's perfectly healthy. If you've seen one of these graphs that they use for the menstrual cycle before, then you might have noticed that it's a bit weird. But basically, this red stuff represents the uterus lining, with the y-axis telling us the thickness of the uterus wall. Stage 1 is known as menstruation, which is the period of bleeding that normally lasts about 4 days, and is due to the breakdown of the uterus lining. We can see this on this first section of the graph, where the thickness of the lining is decreasing. Stage 2 is when the uterus lining starts to build up again, and becomes a thick spongy layer, with lots of blood vessels in it. It lasts around 10 days, up to day 14, and its role is to prepare the uterus lining for a fertilized egg. Because remember, the fertilized egg implants into the uterus lining. Stage 3 is ovulation. This takes place in a single day, and involves the egg being released from one of the ovaries. Stage 4, though, stretches all the way to day 28, and it involves maintaining the lining of the uterus. Once we get to the end of the cycle, if no fertilized egg has made it to the uterus, then the uterus wall would start to break down. So it would be back to stage 1, and the whole cycle would repeat. However, if there was a fertilized egg, then it would implant into the uterus lining and slowly develop into a fetus. Remember that if this does happen, the cycle doesn't go back to stage 1 again. The menstrual cycle would actually stop, because the woman's pregnant, so there'd be no need for this cycle. We now need to take a look at the hormones that are responsible for this cycle. So let's get rid of most of this, and draw the hormone levels onto our graph. We've already seen estrogen, which is produced in the ovaries, and what it does here is stimulate the uterus lining to grow. So we see the level of estrogen increase in stage 2 as the uterus develops, and then fall once the lining's grown. Meanwhile, progesterone, which is also produced in the ovaries, increases in stage 4 and maintains the lining of the uterus. So if progesterone levels drop, then the uterus lining breaks down, and that's what restarts the cycle. The other 2 hormones are luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. And both of these are produced in the pituitary gland, which remember is a small gland behind your eyes, near your brain. The role of FSH is to stimulate one of the eggs to mature in one of the ovaries, while LH stimulates the release of that egg on day 14, which we call ovulation. The last thing we need to cover is how these hormones interact with one another. Starting at the beginning, FSH stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, which is why we see higher levels of FSH just before estrogen starts to increase. As the estrogen levels start to increase though, they start to inhibit FSH, which is an example of negative feedback. But when estrogen levels get high, they stimulate the release of LH, which causes this LH spike and results in ovulation. The last interaction we need to know is that progesterone inhibits both LH and FSH. And that's everything you need to know about the menstrual cycle. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.